everybody, this is Michelle Fox and welcome back to The Simple Quilter. Today's topic is going to be how to square up your quilt after you've had your quilt quilted. Now, it's important to remember that this step does help improve the appearance of your quilt, but you also need to be squaring up the blocks as you go to help ensure a more pleasing appearance to your overall quilt. So be sure to watch my video from last week which shows you how to square up your quilt blocks as you go. The quilt I have behind me is a quilt I made several years ago. It's made from a flour sack reproduction line, and I'll step aside so you can see this quilt. Now you may wonder, what does it mean to square up our quilt after it's been quilted? It just means that we're going to cut it or trim it so that there are 90-degree angles at every corner and that all the edges are straight. And we do this for two reasons. Number one, it helps make the binding easier to put on our quilts, and then it just again gives a more pleasing appearance to our overall quilt. Now, the basic tools that you need when you are squaring up your quilt are, you do need a square ruler. You don't absolutely have to have a square ruler, but I like to have a square ruler. And then I also use my long ruler that is 8.5 by 24.5. You also need a rotary blade with a sharp blade on it, and you want to be sure you have a sharp blade because you're going to be cutting through several layers. Now, just a couple of things, just a couple of tips. Number one, you want to be sure to have your table at a height that's comfortable for you. This table's just a little bit low for me, but this is as high as I could get it with the way my room is set up and with the tables that I have. But I did lower my cutting table so that more of my quilt could be supported. You don't want large amounts of your quilt hanging off and pulling on your quilt, so you want to try to have as much of it up on the surface as possible. You want to be sure that you're cutting only one layer, so be sure to check underneath and make sure that none of the quilt has doubled back on itself. And you want to make sure that all the fabric is nice and flat. The first thing I'm going to do is just check out to see how wide I can cut this. And it looks like I can cut this right at 5 inches, and I'm just going to be trimming off a little bit. So I want to be sure that I'm lining up the lines on my ruler with the seams to get this as straight as possible. So this is right at 5 inches and this is right at 5 inches. Then you're just going to make a couple of cuts. First of all, I'm going to cut this excess off down here. Okay, and I'm just going to make one long straight cut. And I'm also going to cut right along here. Next thing you're going to do is you're just going to pull the quilt towards you. Again, making sure that there's only one layer and none of the fabric is doubled underneath. Okay, I'm going to switch to my long ruler now, right at 5 inches, and I'm going to make another cut. I'm going to move the quilt towards me again. Now a little bit of this is going to have to hang over the edge. But most of the quilt is supported up on the tabletop. Again, I'm going to check just to make sure everything's on top. There's nothing underneath that I'm going to be cutting that I don't want to cut. Again, I'm going to line that up at 5 inches. I'm going to make my next cut. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put my square ruler down here, being sure to line these lines up there so that I know when I make this cut it's going to be straight. Okay, now I've turned the quilt and I'm just going to again line this up at 5 inches. Line that up 5 there and 5 here. It's lined up along here, and I'm going to make my cut. And I'm just going to keep doing that until I get to the end. Now the nice thing about this quilt is it has a nice border so that you can follow along using the seam for your border, but you don't always have that option when you're cutting and trimming up your quilt. Now if you don't have a square ruler, you don't have to have a square ruler, so I just want to show you this. I did the 5-inch line through here, and then when I get to here, just using this ruler, there's 5 inches, I can just line these lines up. I really do prefer to use my bigger ruler, but I wanted to show you how to do this just in case you don't have a bigger ruler. Okay. Alright, and I'm just going to keep going around and trimming until the whole quilt top is trimmed. I'm really pleased with how well this quilt turned out. Okay, so the next quilt I want to show you is one that does not have a border on it. Okay, now on this quilt, as you can see, there's no border, and I want to be sure to preserve the 1/4 of an inch out here so that I don't cut off my points when I put on the binding. So what I'm going to do, and to me, if you have to leave a tiny bit of the batting, that's okay, as long as when you fold your binding over that it will all be covered up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to line this up, being sure to try to keep a 1/4 of an inch at all my points, including these down here. As you can see, this line's not on a seam line, but it's running parallel to a seam line. Okay, now I checked already underneath to make sure I'm only cutting 1 layer. Okay, and I'm just going to make my first cut here. Trim this off there. Okay, 90-degree angle. So it is a little bit different when you don't have a border, because you have to be sure you're preserving that 1/4 of an inch seam so that you're not cutting off all your points. I'm going to try to be sure these are lining up here so that I've got a straight cut. Okay, so I'm going to line this up to make sure I have a 90-degree angle. This is working out good because this can go on the center seam line there. Want to be sure I'm going to be preserving my 1/4 of an inch along the edge there, and I'm going to go ahead and go up, and then I'm going to go over just a little bit. And then I'm going to turn the quilt, and I'll just keep going until it's all done. So when I'm done trimming everything, I like to go ahead and take care of my scraps, and I really try to sort these out. I'm going to just trim this up here. Just going to trim that off just a tad. Okay, because if you take care of it right now, then it's not such a big mess later. Okay, so this piece right here, I can probably get some 2-inch strips out of this. So I'm just going to fold this up and put this in my scrap bin. This will go in my dog bed bag. All right. And let's see what we have here. That off. I don't want to mess with having to rip that off, and that will go in my dog bed bag. Now, instead of, let's see, instead of just I'm definitely not going to unpick these threads, so I'm just going to trim a little bit off here. Just enough so that I can separate the two. Okay. Then I don't think I'll be able to use this for anything, so this is going to go in my dog beds. This is going in my dog beds. And I think I will save this piece. And put this in my scrap bin. Scrap bins. That might make a neat binding. You could also go ahead and cut that into 2.5 strips for binding. That'd make a neat binding piece. And then I'll just do the same thing to this. And then now this is a pretty big piece that's left over. Oh, those are already separated. Now I will use this. This is a big piece. I can use this for some table runners or wall hangings. I'll just fold this up where I store my, and I'll put this where I store my batting scraps. And I'll just put this in my scrap bins where the grains are. Okay, so then all that's cleaned up and you don't have a big mess left over to deal with. I almost forgot to mention my new quilt shirt. You probably have noticed it throughout the video. If you like it, check out the link below for the So Many Quilty Things Etsy website. There's a 15% off coupon for all quilting and sewing apparel. So if you're interested, check out that link below. If you've enjoyed this video, please give me a thumbs up, subscribe if you haven't, share with a friend, and as always, leave a comment below. I love to get the comments and try to reply to each and every one. And until next time, have fun quilting.